Art mirrors the human condition.
We uncover its hidden patterns,
Experience human creativity.
elevated by digital analysis.
Welcome to the Academy.
Join the journey.
Welcome to This Explainer. I was thinking recently, how did people actually remember their history before we all had smartphones or the internet in our pockets? Well, long before television, radio, or even recorded sound, human beings had this absolutely profound way of preserving their history. Before we could easily write things down or, just press record, we used song. Think about it. A melody makes words incredibly easy to remember. So our ancestors essentially used music as a vital, living oral archive. It was literally the way we preserved family tragedies, religious beliefs, and massive historical events, passing them down across generations. When we look at the great American musical traditions, it's clear that each one gave us a really distinct gift. Blues, for instance, gave popular music this incredible emotional confession. Jazz gave us breathtaking improvisational freedom. But country and folk, well, they gave popular music something equally fundamental. They gave us the power of the story. Okay, let's dive into this. Because while other genres might just ask, how do I feel? Country and folk ask deep, dramatic, narrative questions. They ask, what happened? Where did I come from? Who did I lose? These genres are entirely built on telling us exactly what happens when ordinary people get caught up in absolutely extraordinary circumstances. And this brilliantly illustrates how we can map out these three distinct American musical dimensions. If you look at the core focus here, blues is totally rooted in emotion, right? This is what I feel. Jazz is all about exploration. Let's discover what we can create right now. But country and folk, they focus almost entirely on the narrative. The core message is always, hey, let me tell you what happened. It's story, front and center, all the way down. So, that brings us to our first major theme, Section 1, the power of the story. Because of this intense focus on narrative, this music acts as memory made audible. It's really not just old music to be filed away in some dusty museum cabinet. It's a living, breathing record of human experience. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly is the difference between folk and country anyway? Well, folk is fundamentally communal. It's usually anonymous, sung on front porches, and just transmitted person to person across the generations. Country, on the other hand, developed as a highly commercial American genre, heavily driven by the recording industry, though it's still rooted in the rural South and Appalachia. But here's the thing, despite those differences, they overlap enormously. Actually, for a huge chunk of the 20th century, the boundary between them was deliberately porous. Because these genres are just so obsessed with narrative, they naturally rely on a recurring cast of characters. We're talking about the farmer, the cowboy, the soldier, the prisoner, the mother, the abandoned lover, the outlaw, and the working man. And these aren't just abstract concepts, They are ordinary, highly vulnerable people, just like us. And what this music does is honestly absolutely beautiful. It takes these marginalized, often overlooked individuals, and it gives them an extraordinary voice. Moving right along to Section 2, cross-cultural musical roots. To really understand how these characters got their voice, we have to look at the geographical centers for this tradition, places like the Appalachian Mountains. Because a lot of these communities were incredibly isolated, traditions were perfectly preserved, but they also actively evolved. And there's a really common misconception out there that country was always just white rural music. But in reality, it emerged from an incredibly rich cross-cultural musical ecosystem. On one hand, we had European settlers bringing over British Isles ballads, dramatic storytelling, and fiddle tunes. But equally essential, absolutely crucial to the mix, were African-American contributions. They brought blues rhythms, call-and-response gospel, and significantly, the banjo. The banjo is an instrument with direct African origins. So without both of these distinct cultural pillars, modern country simply wouldn't exist. No way. Which leads us to Section 3, the commercial country boom. Now, when commercial recording technology finally arrived in the early 20th century, everything completely shifted. The music moved from those front porches of Appalachia straight into professional recording studios. This allowed these local, regional traditions to be captured, pressed onto records, and distributed to a massive national audience. We can actually trace this commercial journey really clearly right here. It kicks off in 1927 with the Bristol Sessions, which people often called the Big Bang of country music. That gave us the beautiful acoustic simplicity of the Carter Family and Jimmie Rodgers. Then jump to the 1940s, and things get a bit tougher, a bit more urban, with rhythmic honky-tonk. And by the 1950s, we arrive at the highly commercialized professional era of Music City, which brought us the polished, super smooth string sections of the Nashville sound. But as the industry got more and more polished, this really fascinating tension emerged around the concept of authenticity. See, in this music, classical perfection isn't the goal. Actually, scratch that. Imperfection is the goal. The singing voice is almost always deliberately imperfect. Singers will use vocal cracks, nasal tones, and this audible strain to prove to you that they have personally experienced the heartbreak in the story. Hank Williams is the absolute prime example of this. His deceptive simplicity completely transformed ordinary emotional despair into these unforgettable, raw musical statements. And that takes us to Section 4, Outlaws and the Marginalized. That growing tension I just mentioned between the raw, authentic emotion and the highly polished commercialization of Nashville, well, it ultimately triggered a full-blown artistic rebellion. Certain musicians started feeling like the roughness and the intimacy were just getting completely lost in all those sophisticated studio arrangements. So you get these legendary figures, Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, Merle Haggard, and Johnny Cash, and they pushed back hard against the Nashville industry. But their movement wasn't just about a different sound. It was a fundamental artistic philosophy. They believed in one simple rule: let the artist control the music. And Johnny Cash, one of those absolute outlaw giants, had this really unique fascination with the marginalized, specifically the archetype of the prisoner. The prisoner is, hands down, the perfect country and folk character, perfectly embodying guilt, regret, isolation, and, surprisingly, hope. Think about Cash's legendary At Folsom Prison live recording. The audience of inmates there wasn't just listening, they were actively participating. In that moment, the boundary between the famous performer and the marginalized listener completely vanished. It's just a stunning moment in music history. All right, Section 5, Folk as Political Protest. So, while country had its outlaw rebellion, the folk tradition was taking a pretty dramatic turn of its own. During the intense struggles of the Great Depression and later the Civil Rights era, the folk singer evolved from being a simple storyteller into an active vocal representative of the people. The central figure of this movement was Woody Guthrie. He famously wrote "This Machine Kills Fascists" right on the front of his guitar. Guthrie operated on the central principle that music belongs strictly to the people. His songs utilize these beautiful, simple melodies to deliver some highly complex social criticisms about things like economic inequality, poverty, and who exactly was being excluded from the American dream. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the tradition shifted entirely when Bob Dylan arrived on the scene. Dylan took that acoustic format and just injected it with surrealism, mythology, and modern poetry. Take a song like "Blowin' in the Wind." It doesn't just tell a straightforward, linear story or dictate a specific political stance. Instead, it asks metaphorical, poetic questions and turns it right back on the listener, essentially asking you, so what do you think? This brings us to Section 6, Traditions Evolve and Merge. Bob Dylan actually proved this by controversially going electric at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. He absolutely refused to let folk just become a static museum piece. Dylan showed everybody that for a tradition to survive, it simply has to evolve. And man, from that electric revolution, the musical boundaries completely dissolved. First, as you can see, we get folk rock, powerfully merging acoustic poetry with electric rock rhythms. Then we see the rise of singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell, transforming the narrative from sweeping community history into really intimate personal diaries. Finally, this whole evolution leads us to modern Americana, a vibrant, incredible umbrella of American roots music that proudly operates without any rigid boundaries at all. And as those boundaries fell, country music reached massive mainstream pop audiences, largely thanks to brilliant songwriters like Dolly Parton. Dolly's work is a literal masterclass in empathy. She writes about family, poverty, and dignity, demonstrating that musical simplicity can carry extraordinary emotional sophistication. She basically allows millions of listeners to step into the shoes of someone else and fully emotionally inhabit their world. So, the crucial point is that regardless of the era, the instruments, or the commercial success, these genres share a deeply unified philosophy. It's a philosophy built solidly on the story, the deep connection to place and memory, the uncompromising demand for authenticity, the bond of community, the deceptive power of simplicity, the bridge of empathy, and of course, the absolute necessity of transformation. Which brings us to the fascinating central paradox of folk and country music. These genres deeply celebrate and revere tradition, yet A song only actually survives because every generation actively changes it. They change a lyric, swap an instrument, or adjust a melody. Ultimately, tradition isn't about perfectly preserving the past like a fossil. It's about making sure the past continues to breathe and live right here in the present. We've seen today how these musical traditions have acted as humanity's oral archive, capturing the laughter, the sorrow, and the resilience of ordinary people. They prove that every individual life is a story absolutely worth preserving. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I'm going to leave you with a thought to reflect on. In the great, ongoing oral archive of humanity, how will your own story be remembered?
Love the masterpiece? Subscribe for more.